Hey guys, and welcome back to another boss guide for Vanilla World of Warcraft. This week, we'll be going over the 4th boss of AQ40, featuring Huhuran. This encounter will be both a DPS and resistance check for your raid, as you will have 5 minutes to kill her before she enrages. Frenzy is a periodic buff that Huhuran gains during the fight, which increases her attack speed and causes her to start casting waves of poison bolts after several seconds. Hunters can remove this effect by using tranquilizing shots and make sure that a rotation is set up before the fight begins. Poison Bolt is Huhuran's signature ability that deals roughly 2000 nature damage to the closest 15 players. This ability only occurs when her health reaches 30% or when she is frenzied. Acid Spit is a damage over time effect that Huhuran casts on the main tank that deals 219 to 281 damage per stack every 2 seconds. Because of this ability, it is advised that during progression, your tanks rotate when their stacks start becoming too high. DPS players will need to stay below the 2 tanks when it comes to threat during the fight. Once AQ40 is on farm status, your raid can transition from 2 tanks to 1 for a higher threat ceiling. Wyvern Sting is an area of effect spell that Huhuran will cast on 10 targets in her melee range, including pets. Players affected by this spell will be put to sleep for the duration, and it's important that this effect is not cleansed, as it will inflict roughly 3000 nature damage to the target. Noxious Poison is a damage over time effect that deals roughly 2900 nature damage over 8 seconds to a random player while also silencing them for the duration. This ability will also spread to nearby players, so make sure to watch your spacing. Lastly, this debuff cannot be cleansed. At 30% health, Huhuran will Berserk, increasing her attack speed, but most importantly she will start unleashing poison bolt volleys at a much faster rate. At this point in the fight, it will be a DPS race to kill her before she kills your raid. Utilizing your most powerful cooldowns and remaining consumables will be crucial in quickly ending the fight. Before moving on to the next section, we need to discuss the nature resistance requirements that your raid will need for this boss encounter. Due to the Poison Bolt's ability that we discussed earlier, your raid will need 15 players to shield the rest of the raid group during the final stretch of the fights when the boss's health reaches 30%. These 15 players will consist of your warriors, rogues, and also hunters if needed. With that said, let's start getting into the details of a melee player's perspective in this encounter. Tanks during this fight should focus on armor, defense, and health over nature resistance due to poison bolt damage not occurring to the last 30% of this fight, as long as your hunters are removing frenzy properly. At the same time, Acid Spit cannot be resisted, and due to this debuff, it is advised to have tank rotations in place for progression raids. Finally, keep in mind that this boss is immune to all forms of taunt. DPS warriors and rogues will need to push for 200 nature resistance unbuffed, however, more is always better, as the only damage you should receive in this fight is from the poison bolt volley. Melee DPS players shouldn't worry about their damage, but instead on survivability, since their role in this fight will be shielding the raid, while caster DPS carry the tail end of the fight. Depending on your guild roster, hunters may be needed to help soak the damage during the Berserk phase, which means that they should focus on building an NR set as well. Finally, don't forget to take advantage of aspects of the wild, which provides party members with an aura, increasing their nature resistance by 60. As the encounter starts, the main tank should position the boss directly in the center of the room. Healers and ranged DPS will need to spread out to avoid spreading Noxious Poison, while your 15 soakers consisting of warriors, rogues, and possibly hunters will need to stack on Huhuran in a tight ball and be closer to her than anyone else in the raid. Once AQ40 is on farm status, you'll be able to transition from 2 tanks to only 1 tank for the entire duration of the fight. For this week's raid perspective segment, I'll be showing you guys one of my earliest AQ40 raids when the content was still fresh to capture some of that progression feeling compared to previous videos. With the boss positioned in the middle of the room and the raid spreading out, I start my DPS rotation while keeping an eye on KTM so I can watch my threat and stay below the 2 tanks. If you look to the right, a lot of healers are very close together, which presents a dangerous situation if they were to get hit by Noxious Poison, so make sure that your raid is spread out much more than we are. At this point, you can see Frenzy being activated on the boss before a hunter uses Tranquilizing Shot to quickly remove it, while the melee DPS are slept due to Wyvern Sting. By this point, we've already covered the majority of this boss's abilities, while others, such as Acid Spit, only affect the current tank, and Poison Bolt Volley should never occur until the Berserk phase. The most important thing about this fight for progression is pacing your raid to be within that 5-minute window of killing her, and also surviving the final stretch of the fight that begins at 30%. Because this was one of our earliest AQ40 raids, a lot of our caster DPS are holding back on damage until she berserks at 30%, since it creates a threat buffer for us. At the same time, I think that players, including myself, are a bit more cautious or conservative during the first couple of weeks of new content, due to learning the mechanics and seeing how far we can push our limits. While the main tank is able to stay in for a long period of time during this fight, remember that your situation may be different, and depending on the gear of your tank, you may need to do a switch earlier. With over 3 minutes left until she enrages, our raid is pacing itself accordingly as the second tank prepares to switch off with the main tank at 36%. Keep in mind that if your tanks are having issues switching, then you can always have a paladin use Blessing of Protection on the main tank to temporarily drop his aggro. Or you can also use a limited invulnerability potion as well. As we head toward the conclusion of the fight, this is the most important part, as your caster DPS will need to use all of their available cooldowns to carry the fight, while the soakers focus on surviving the Poison Bolt Volley. But with proper gear and consumables, your raid will be successful in the end, allowing you to move on to the next boss encounter. As always, thank you guys for watching, and feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Join me next time for the 5th boss of AQ40, the Twin Emperors.